Do you believe in monsters? Have you ever met a monster? Well, come meet Heather, and she can tell you all about monsters. Today's story is called Monsters Don't Count, and it's written and illustrated by Paul Shibley.
But, Daddy, there's a monster in my room!
Cried Heather.
I don't want to go to bed. I'm scared.
Heather hugged her teddy ever tighter. Oh, honey, there's no such thing as monsters. But if you think you see one, I'll come and chase him away, okay?
Oh, okay, Daddy, but I still think there's a monster in my room.
Heather's dad bent over, tucked her in, and kissed her gently on the forehead. Good night, Heather, he said as he turned off the light. Sweet dreams.
Good night, Daddy,
said Heather softly as her dad closed the door. Heather lay very still.
It's so dark,
she thought.
Why didn't Daddy leave the light on?
But after a while, as Heather stared into the darkness, she was able to spot her old rocking horse resting in the faint light by the window. And a thin strip of light now squeezed in beneath her door. Heather strained to look about the room without moving a muscle. She pulled the covers up tight. Her eyes darted from one shadow to the next.
There's a monster in those shadows,
thought Heather. Her left foot started to itch. The itch became a big itch. But Heather was too frightened to move. What was she going to do? Now her nose started to itch. She started to wiggle her nose slightly, when suddenly there was a noise. She's sure she heard a noise. Heather tried to yell, but the words got stuck in her throat.
Daddy! Mommy!
Another noise. Heather couldn't stand it any longer. Before you could say monster, she threw back the covers, hopped out of bed, took 2 quick steps up onto her dollhouse, and flicked on the light. Who was more startled, Heather or the 3 monsters huddled at the foot of her bed? Screamed the monsters. They scrambled over each other, jumped into the closet, and slammed the door shut. Heather was just about to run for her dad when a deep voice stopped her cold.
Wait! Don't go!
Heather froze. She wiped away a tear. Then, with all the courage she could gather, she stuttered.
What are you doing in my room?
Oh, well, we wanted to frighten you.
Well, you did.
Stammered Heather.
Why'd you want to frighten me anyway?
Because we're angry.
Said a second monster.
Everybody thinks that monsters don't count.
Sobbed the monsters. The closet door shook. Heather stepped up to it and said,
Don't be silly. Everybody counts. Even mean old monsters count.
But we don't know how to count,
cried the third monster.
You mean you can't count numbers?
Asked Heather.
I don't believe it. Well, I can count all the way to 10.
She gently turned the doorknob and opened the closet door. The monsters were crammed in so tight they could hardly breathe. They blinked sadly at Heather. She slowly leaned forward, and with a wagging finger she said,
I'll teach you to count to 10, but you'll have to promise me you'll never, never, never scare little children again. Promise, and cross your hearts.
The monsters looked at one another, wiped away their tears, nodded their heads, and said,
Okay.
Okay.
Promise. We'll never scare little children again.
Never again.
They struggled to cross their hearts and kept poking each other in the tummy. It was that cramped in the closet. The monsters tumbled out and clapped their hands and slapped their tails noisily. What excitement! Heather had to be careful she didn't get her feet stomped on.
Shush!
Scolded Heather.
Or my daddy will hear you, and you'll have to hide again. You don't want to have to go into the closet again, do you?
The monsters stopped immediately and shook their heads.
Oh, no, we don't want to do that again.
Okay then, repeat after me.
Said Heather sternly.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
She said quickly. For a moment, the monsters didn't react at all. Then they looked at each other helplessly. They looked back at Heather and tried to count.
1, 3, 5, 2, 6, 10.
My brain hurts.
Stop!
Demanded Heather. The monsters looked sad.
This isn't going to be as easy as I thought.
Said Heather, scratching her head. She bit her lower lip and scrunched her nose deep in thought. She tapped her foot. What to do? What to do? Then, suddenly, she had an idea. Heather grinned with eyes wide open.
Okay, I know. Let's start at the beginning. The number 1.
She poked a monster playfully.
You each have 1 horn, or nose, or whatever that is.
1 horn.
One.
Repeated the monsters triumphantly, and they all pressed their horns with their fists, making strange honking sounds.
And
Continued Heather.
you've got 2 floppy ears.
She pinched her ears and wiggled her fingers. The monsters shouted excitedly, flopping their ears.
1, 2.
2.
Heather dropped to her knees, grabbed a monster's foot, and lifted it. Whoops! Look out! The monster almost lost his balance. As Heather tapped on the monster's foot, the monster giggled uncontrollably. He was very ticklish.
Look!
Said Heather.
You have 3 pads on each foot. 1, 2, 3.
The monsters acted very silly as they tried to see the bottoms of their feet. They hopped and rolled around and bumped into each other. Heather had trouble just keeping out of the way, and the monsters grunted so, "Arr, grah," that Heather couldn't help but laugh. Then Heather hopped onto the bed and grabbed a monster by the arm, took his hand, and counted his claws.
1, 2, 3, 4.
The monsters stopped hopping and looked down at their hands. Much to a monster's surprise, Heather jumped onto his back and climbed up onto his shoulders. She reached forward and grabbed the monster's bow tie.
Don't you see?
She snickered.
You have 5 little triangles on your bow ties. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
As the monsters tried to glance down at their bow ties, Heather slid off the monster's back onto the bed.
Look! 6 funny stars on each of your funny hats. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
The monsters quickly leaned back and tilted their heads to see their hats. But try as they might, they just couldn't see.
Silly monsters.
Said Heather.
Look at each other's hats, not your own.
Heather fell back on the bed in a fit of giggles. While the monsters looked at each other's hats and counted the stars, Heather hopped up to one and playfully poked him in the belly.
Did you know that you each have 7 red spots on your tummies? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
The silly monsters took to poking each other in their tummies. Then the monsters gathered round Heather. She yawned, then wiggled her toes.
I have more toes than you,
said Heather proudly. The monsters were upset, but just for a moment. Then the shortest monster wiggled his toes, too.
See?
Said Heather.
You have 8 toes in all. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
Suddenly, Heather grew very serious. She told them with a stern voice,
My mom says you should wash your feet often, especially since you go everywhere barefoot.
The monsters looked puzzled.
And have you combed your hair lately? What a mess!
The monsters removed their hats and gently stroked their hair. Heather stretched to have a closer look.
I don't believe it,
She said with amazement.
You each have exactly 9 stringy hairs. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
As the monsters felt their hair, Heather slipped between them and looked up and down the monsters' backs and silently counted.
How fascinating. You all have exactly 10 purple scales that run from the back of your necks all the way to the tips of your tails. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Yow! Heather had to quickly jump up and down as the monsters spun their tails around, trying to count their scales. Round and round they went. What a circus! Heather never jumped so much in her life.
We can count!
We can count all the way to 10!
All the way to 10!
shouted the very excited monsters. They squeezed Heather so tight she could scarcely breathe.
Listen to this, Heather.
Listen to this.
The monsters shouted with delight. They all called out together.
1 horn, 2 ears, 3 pads, 4 claws, 5 triangles, 6 stars,
7 spots, 8 toes, 9 hairs.
10 scales. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
You did it!
Cried Heather happily.
Now you don't have to be angry anymore, and I can finally go to bed. Wow, all that jumping and the counting. You know, that was a lot of counting. I'm pooped.
She yawned. With that, she crawled onto the bed and turned to the monsters.
Good night, monsters. That was fun. Turn off the light on your way out, please.
She said sleepily.
Oh, and go out through the window so you don't scare my mom and dad, okay?
But the monsters only blinked sadly.
What's wrong?
Asked Heather with a sigh. The monsters shuffled uneasily. The smallest monster stepped forward and stuttered.
We don't know how the alphabet. Can you teach us, please?
What?
Groaned Heather.
The alphabet? Oh, no, not the alphabet. I'm too tired. I quit.
With that, Heather turned off the light and crawled into bed. For a moment, all was still. Heather smiled contentedly, thinking the monsters had left. Then, suddenly, she heard a noise. It was the monsters. One monster softly giggled.
A is for arm, B is for belly, and C is for claw.
Oh, no.
Heather moaned.